Hello and welcome back to part 3 of our lecture series dealing with job order costing. In the previous video we already saw how to calculate the predetermined overhead rate. So in this video we're going to see what do we do once we have already calculated that predetermined overhead rate. So your objectives for this video are twofold. Number one, you should be able to apply overhead cost to a job, again using that predetermined overhead rate, and you should also be able to compute the total cost of a job as well as the unit product cost of a job. Okay, we will be using the the predetermined overhead rate, which we already calculated, but we call that another name for that, if you will, is the plant-wide predetermined overhead rate, meaning we're just using one predetermined overhead rate. As you saw from your readings, we possibly could use multiple predetermined overhead rates, and we will talk about that later, but right now we're just focusing on simply applying one predetermined overhead rate. So the best way to really do this is to kind of get into an example. Look at an example of how do we calculate it, the predetermined overhead rate, versus how do we apply the predetermined overhead rate. So as a quick review, let's look at how do we first calculate, or how do we first determine the predetermined overhead rate. So if you see here, we have parent company. They estimate that it will require 160,000 direct labor hours to meet the coming period's estimated production level. In addition to that, the company estimates total fixed manufacturing overhead at $200,000 and variable manufacturing overhead costs of $2.75 per direct labor hour. Now, just by reading that, and if you think back to video 2, we know what the 4 steps are, right, to calculating the predetermined overhead rate. Guess what? Those instructions, let me rephrase that, the information they gave us kind of walks us through those 4 steps. Number 1, figure out what is the estimated allocation base. Right? What's the denominator? It's 160,000 direct labor hours. Estimate your fixed. Well, we already know what our fixed are, or our fixed expenses are, $200,000. They already told us the variable manufacturing overhead cost of $2.75 per direct labor hour. So just by reading the problem, we got steps 1, 2, and 3, or my version was 1, 2A, 2B, right? Now we're going to calculate the total cost, right? So we got to think back to, I believe it was video 1, or excuse me, chapter 1, where we solved our formula for total cost. Y equals A plus B of X, or B times X. A is our fixed cost. B represents the variable cost per unit, and X represents the activity level. So if we take A, which is our fixed cost of $200,000, plus $2.75, which is our variable cost per direct labor hour, times our total labor hours that we're going to use, 160,000, we get $440,000. So if we add the variable portion of the fixed manufacturing overhead and the variable portion of the manufacturing overhead, guess what we get? Total estimated manufacturing overhead of $640,000. That's our estimated total overhead cost. We divide that by our total estimated direct labor hours, which is 160,000. We get a predetermined overhead rate of $4 per direct labor hour. That's how you calculate the predetermined overhead rate. Now we need to apply it. Okay, so we now have to apply direct labor. We apply direct labor by using the predetermined overhead rate, which is $4, and then we multiply it by the actual hours incurred in the job. I want to say that again. We multiply the predetermined overhead rate by the actual direct labor that was incurred in the job. Okay? There's a key here. When we're calculating the predetermined overhead rate, we use estimates. When we are applying the predetermined overhead rate, we use the actual allocation base incurred. So we already got an allocation or a rate, a predetermined overhead rate of $4. We need to allocate that we need to allocate manufacturing overhead to job A-143 based on direct labor hours. This job actually incurred 8 direct labor hours, so we take the actual direct labor hours of 8, multiply it by the predetermined overhead rate of 4, we get $32. So guess what? We can now calculate what is our total cost. What is the total cost of this job? Meaning, how much did it cost us to produce wooden cargo crates for what we use, for example, the Ford company, right? Excuse me. Very, very, very easy to do, right? We already got direct material, direct labor, manufacturing overhead. We saw how to trace direct material and direct labor to a job. We just saw how to allocate manufacturing overhead to a job. Remember, we manufacture it based on, we allocate manufacturing overhead based on the predetermined overhead rate times the actual allocation driver that was incurred in the job. Okay, so now we can go ahead and we can compute the total cost of a job, and we can also break that cost down using or to determine what's the unit product cost. Okay, so we already have all our costs. All we got to do is add them up. Total direct material, total direct labor, total manufacturing overhead gives us our total cost. So we can see here that if we take the $116 plus the $120 plus the $32, guess what? We get a total cost of $268. So it cost us $268 to make 2 units or 2 wooden cargo crates. Hey, how do you know it's 2? Well, look at the job cost sheet, right? Because we're using this job cost sheet from the time that we start the job to the time we finish the job. Well, this job was completed on 3/5 of 2017, right? We see that underneath the date initiated. Then we see the units completed, 2. So it cost us $268 to make 2 wooden cargo crates, okay? In order to figure out the unit product cost, guess what? Very simple. We divide total cost by the number of units we actually produced. Well, we produced 2. So if we take $268 divided by 2, we get $134. Each crate cost us $134. Okay, so let's do a quick check right here and work with me here. Job RW53 at NW Fab Incorporated required $200 of direct materials and 10 direct labor hours at $15 per hour. Estimated total overhead for the year was $760, $760,000, and estimated direct labor costs were 20,000 hours. What would be recorded as the whole cost of job WR53? Now we have to calculate this out, right? How do we do that? Very, very simple. Bear with me here for a second. I want to see if I can try something. Okay, so we know to get the cost we need direct material, direct labor, and MOH? Well, the problem tells us that, hey, guess what? $200 of direct material was used. So our direct material is $200. How do we calculate direct labor? Can we calculate direct labor? Well, sure we can. We just take the hourly rate that we pay our employees times the amount of hours they work on a job. We have that information here. $10 a direct labor hour, or sorry, 10 direct labor hours at 15 bucks a pop. So I can calculate direct labor as 10 times 15, right? It's 150 bucks. Okay. Now, they tell us that we have estimated overhead of $760,000. We have direct labor hours for this coming period to be $20,000. Guess what? We can calculate the predetermined overhead rate. So bear with me as I pull out my calculator here. So if we take our, there we go. If we take out our, or if we take our estimated overhead of $760,000 divided by 20,000, sorry, 760 divided by 20,000 gives us $38. Guess what? This $38 is the predetermined overhead rate. Okay? So, since we have our predetermined overhead rate, we know that our estimated, our denominator or our cost driver is direct labor hours. We know the exact number of direct labor hours that this job incurred, 10. We can then calculate what our manufacturing overhead is. So we take our 10, which is the direct labor hours incurred for this job, times 38, we get 380. So to figure out what the total cost is for this job, we just add up direct material, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. And if my math is correct, we should get 730. And we're right. And there's the calculation right there. Okay? Now, it's important to understand that we need to make sure that when we implement job order costing, it's important that we need to understand our cost classifications, right? And we need to understand how costs are traced, okay? So there is a possibility for inaccuracies in job order costing. Well, where do those arise from? Well, number one, we could possibly incorrectly classify costs as being direct and indirect when they're not. Okay, so that's number one. So we need to first understand direct labor, direct and indirect costs and how and their traceability. Okay, we've already did chapter 1, so you guys understand that. So as long as we can accurately trace direct materials and direct cost, and we can actually and correctly identify what costs are direct, we're okay, right? We're okay there. The problem really lies with the the overhead costs, Okay, and the reason why is because we as managers, we might not allocate correctly the manufacturing overhead costs, meaning we don't have a crystal ball, right? We don't know exact costs that we're going to incur. We have an idea, right? Something might happen through the process where we incur more costs than we have anticipated, right? Maybe um, a machine breaks down, right? And remember, overhead is all the indirects. Well, we can't directly, or we can't easily and conveniently trace the cost of equipment that we use on a job, so we have to allocate it, and we estimate, a certain amount. Well, what if something happens and that machine breaks down and we have to spend a lot of maintenance hours or a lot of maintenance dollars to fix that machine and get it back up and running, right? That's going to increase the overhead. Okay, so that is one issue with job order costing, and that's the estimation process, right? Accurately estimating what those overheads are, what those overhead costs are, allocating the amount of allocation base. So if we have bad estimates, guess what? Our allocation is going to be, and our costing method is going to either be over costed or under costed. Okay, we already talked about choosing the allocation base, right? Very simple. We know that we need to pick an allocation base that drives the overhead cost. Very simple. And we say drives, basically we're saying what incurs that cost. Okay, so if labor or indirect labor causes manufacturing overhead to increase, then we should use the direct labor hour as our allocation base. Okay, so we can get a little bit more accurate, if you will, if we first of all tighten up our estimates, number one, and number two, if we actually use multiple overhead rates. Okay, and when we come back in our next video, we're going to see exactly how do we calculate total cost, unit product cost, using multiple predetermined overhead rates. Now, I'm going to give you a spoiler alert in our review. Guess what? If you know how to do this problem, you can do multiple predetermined overhead rates. Okay, it's that simple, because we just use different predetermined overhead rates. If you know how to calculate it at a plant-wide basis, you should easily be able to calculate it on, for multiple situations. Okay, so let's not forget our real takeaway here, which again, our real takeaway is recognizing that, bear with me here. Okay. Our real takeaway here is recognizing that, hey, when we apply manufacturing overhead, we're using the actual cost driver that was incurred on the job, whether that's direct labor hours, machine hours, direct labor dollars, whatever. We're using the actual to get to determine what that predetermined overhead rate is. We're predetermining it, so we have to use estimates, but when we're applying that, we're using actual drivers. Okay, that's the real takeaway. So again, when we come back, we're going to go ahead and look at multiple predetermined overhead rates. So please tune in for that one.